The right way to answer. Theory exam questions.
The first thing you have to note is to actually look at the instruction, and it says answer all the questions. Some will say answer 3 out of 4, some will say answer 4 out of 5. The first thing you have to do is to look at the instruction. The next thing is to look at the time. 2 hours for this paper is a theory exam. Next thing is look at 2 hours, and then you use the 2 hours and calculate how many minutes you are going to give for each question. The key point here is that you should leave time for revision. So I'm going to leave about 30 minutes for revision, and that's 15 to 30 minutes, and use 1.5 hours. That is 90 minutes. For the time I will spend for each question, that will be 90 minutes divided by 4 questions. That will give you about 22 minutes. So you can say you use about 20 minutes to answer each of the question. Now, it's important that you use time to calculate how much time you spend on each question, so that you do not waste time and you meet up in answering all the questions before the 2 hours is up. Here it says use one example each to explain 3 different ways our body responds to stress. The next thing you're going to note, of course, are the marks. The marks. This one has 6 marks, while this one has 9 marks. Next thing you'll note is also the keywords, which is the example. Use one example. It says explain, it says 3, and it says different ways our body responds to. So response is another key thing. So you have about 3 there. So whatever you're going to write here, you must make sure that you expatiate on what you write, explain how the body actually responds to stress, and you should mention 3 different ways it does so, using one example to explain each of these 3 ways. This is what I mean for question 1. The answer is flight, freeze, and fight. So when I explain each of these ones, I will now go ahead to use an example. Like, for example, when I'm facing a battle or something, I'll use it to explain what someone does, the meaning of flight, then the meaning of freeze, then the meaning of fight, to explain it for me to get 6 marks. Now, when you look at the marks, you also calculate how it will be shared, being your lecturer's mind, so your examiner's mind. 6 marks means 2 marks for each of the answered questions. So if you do 2 times 3, that will give you 6. Whatever you're writing, make sure that you write enough for 2 marks, which is probably small. But when it comes to 9 marks, it means that this is 3 times 3 for it to have 9 marks. So you note them. For 5 marks, this one is straight. When they say list, it just means that you should just list 5 things, and in total, it will give you your complete 20 marks. When it comes to things like discourse, you have to is another word for explanation. It's just a synonym. This one is 8 marks, 8 marks, which means that to fully explain how stress affects the male, make sure that you have each point for each to make sure that it's 8 marks. Try and envision how it was given to you in your lecture notes, and know what your examiner wants. For questions like number 3, as a public health professional, use some examples to explain how a stressful situation triggers body's response, and that. Just note public health professional. So you are writing in view, in that perspective, as a public health professional. And it says here, use some examples. Some examples means about 3 or more, not less than 3 for some. Then explain, of course, not doing explain, and it means stressful situation. So just write it in a way that it will amount to 20 marks. You can add more examples and make it 5. Now let's talk about differentiate. Now when people hear differentiate, they always want to draw a table. It's not always so. If they did not use a table in your lecture notes, you don't use a table to explain this. To differentiate between chronic stress and burnout, you can just use your words and first define what chronic stress is, then relate it to how it's different from burnout. You can say chronic stress is the stress that does this, while burnout is the stress, is the extreme end of stress. You can now use one example to explain what you mean by it. Then you can now define it in another way and use another example to explain what you actually mean by each of them. And you should note, of course, this is 6 marks. That means for each example you use, it's going to be 3 marks, or you can say 2 marks and give 1 mark for definition. Always know that when they say things like this, you always start by differentiating it using the definition. Same thing applies to the last question, which is 8 marks. That means we have 2, that will give you 8 marks. Using 4 strategies, you know that for each strategy you mention, it's 2 marks. We explain time management. You can go ahead to mention 4 different strategies of time management, like Pomodoro technique and the rest of how it can actually reduce stress. Make sure you always write it in a proper format, and always explain. And if there's any drawing that you need to do, always draw it to further explain whatever you need. Now you should note places like this, of course, if there's a drawing, you go ahead to explain the physiological changes so that you can get more marks to attain 20 marks. Don't just explain or write in one sentence and paragraph. Make sure that when you are writing for heavy marks, you should write enough, more than 5 lines. 5 lines is too small. Depending on the size of your handwriting, you can write up to half a page for each of whatever they say you should explain. It's better to overwrite than to underwrite, if you get what I mean. But always make sure that you don't pass your limit. Make sure you use a wristwatch or a classroom clock to time yourself so that you are able to attempt all questions. That is another tip. Make sure you attempt all questions. Even if you don't know the question, always write something. Even if you feel it's rubbish, always write something, and you never know what you are going to get. Don't forget to like, share and follow for more tips like this.